It's an overflow crowd, but that's very good. Actually, what I'm doing today is excerpts from a book that was titled The 100-Year-Old Man Who Climbed Out the Window and Disappeared. This is written by, now this, I hope I don't offend anybody who's Swedish here, because this man is Jonas Johansson, or Jonas Johansson. He was born in southern Sweden in 1961, and he started working as a journalist for a number of newspapers. This excerpt for today is from a novel entitled The 100-Year-Old Man Who Climbed Out the Window and Disappeared.
Myra, can you push the microphone a little bit? That's it. That's better.
Okay, can you hear better? Okay. Shall I sing? So this is the excerpt from it. This is the book that it came from. Says, this playful book will remind you to live life to the fullest. Okay, I'm in favor of that. I try every day is right. And so that's what it is. As I say, I don't know if you're Swedish, you would pronounce it Jonas Jonasson or Jonas Jonasson. So if I offend anybody, I apologize, because I really don't know. Anyway, as I say, the book is The 100-Year-Old Man Who Climbed Out the Window and Disappeared. Monday, March 2nd, 2005. You might think he could have made up his mind earlier and been man enough to inform his surroundings of his decision. But Alan Carlson had never been given to ponder things too long. So the idea had barely taken hold in the old man's head before he opened the window of his room on the ground floor of the old folks' home in the town of Malmö-Köping and stepped out onto the flower bed. This maneuver required a bit of effort, since Alan was 100 years old, on this very day, as a matter of fact. There was less than an hour to go before his birthday party would begin in the lounge of the old folks' home. The mayor would be there, and the local paper, and all the other old people, and the entire staff led by bad-tempered director Alice. It was only the birthday boy himself who didn't intend to show up. Alan Carlson hesitated as he stood there in the flower bed that ran along the side of the old folks' home. He was wearing a brown jacket with brown trousers, and on his feet he had a pair of brown indoor slippers. He was not a fashion plate. People rarely are at that age. He was on the run from his own birthday party, another unusual thing for this 100-year-old, not least because even being 100 is pretty rare. Alan thought that about whatever he should make the effort to crawl back in through the window to get his hat and shoes. But when he felt his wallet in his inside pocket, he decided that would suffice. Director Alice had repeatedly shown that she had a sixth sense wherever he had hid his vodka. She found it, and she might be nosing around in there even now, suspicious that something fishy was going on. Better to be on the way while he could. Alan thought as he stepped out of the flower bed on creaking knees. In his wallet, as far as he could remember, he had a few notes saved. A good thing, since it probably wouldn't be free to go into hiding. He turned to take one last look at the old folks' home that until a few moments ago he had thought would be his last residence on earth. And then he told himself that he could die some other time in some other place. The 100-year-old man set off in his pea slippers, so called because men of an advanced age rarely pee further than their shoes. First through a park, and then alongside an open field where a market was occasionally held in the otherwise quite quiet provincial town. After a few yards, Alan went back around the back of the district's medieval church and sat down on a bench next to some gravestones to rest his aching knees. The piety in the area was not such that Alan worried about being disturbed. He noted an ironic coincidence. He was born the same year as a Henning Algerson, who lay beneath the stone just across from the bench. But there was an important difference. Henning had given up the ghost 61 years earlier. If Alan had been more curious, he might have wondered what Henning died of at the age of 39. But Alan did not get into other people's business, if he could avoid it, which he usually could. Instead, he thought that he had probably been mistaken when he'd sat in the old folks' home, feeling as if he might as well be dead. However, many aches and pains he suffered, it had to be much more interesting and instructive to be on the run from Director Alice than to be lying rigid 6 feet under. Upon which thought the birthday boy, despite his complaining knees, got up and said goodbye to Henning Algerson and continued on his badly planned fight. Alan cut across the churchyard to the south until a stone wall appeared in his path. It wasn't more than 3 feet high, but Alan was a centurion, not a high jumper. On the other side was Malkerping's bus station, and the old man suddenly realized that his rickety legs were taking him toward a building that could be very useful. Once, many years earlier, Alan had crossed the Himalayas. That was no picnic. Alan thought about that experience now as he stood before the last hurdle between himself and the station. He considered the matter so intently that the stone wall in front of his eyes seemed to shrink. And when it was at its very lowest, Alan crept over it, age and knees be damned. Malkerping is not what you'd call a bustling town, and this sunny weekday morning was no exception. Alan had met a living soul. He had not met a living soul since he had suddenly decided not to show up at his own 100th birthday party. The station waiting room was almost empty when Alan shuffled in. Almost. On the right were 2 ticket windows, one closed. Behind the other sat a little man with small, round glasses, thin hair combed to one side, and a uniform vest. The man gave him an irritated look as he raised his eyes from his computer screen. Perhaps the current crowd was too much for him, because over in the corner stood a young man of slight build, with long, greasy blonde hair, a scraggly beard, and a jean jacket with the words, "Never Again," on the back. Perhaps the young man was illiterate, since he was pulling at the door to the handicapped restroom as if the sign "out of order" in black lettering against an orange-colored background had no meaning. After a moment, he did move to the door to the restroom next to it, but there he faced a different problem. Evidently, he didn't want to be parted from his big gray suitcase on wheels, but the restroom was simply too small for the 2 of them. It seemed to Alan that the young man would either have to leave the suitcase outside while he relieved himself, or allow the suitcase to occupy the restroom while he himself remained outside. But Alan had more pressing concerns. Making an effort to lift his legs to the right sequence, he shuffled with small steps up to the little man in the open ticket window, inquired as to the possibility of public transport in some direction, as any all would do, within the next few minutes, and if there was, what would it cost? The little man looked tired. He had probably lost track of things halfway through Alan's inquiry, because after a few seconds he said, "And where is it you want to go?" Alan took a deep breath and reminded the little man that he had already stated that the actual destination, and for that matter, the means of transport, were of less importance than A, the time of departure, and B, the cost. The little man silently inspected his timetables and let Alan's words sink in. Bus number 202 departs for Strängnäs in 3 minutes. Would that work? Yes, Alan thought it would. The little man told him that the bus departed from outside the terminal door and that it'd be most convenient to buy a ticket directly from the driver. Alan wondered what the little man did behind the window if he didn't sell tickets, but he didn't say anything. The little man possibly wondered the same thing. Alan thanked him for his help and tried to tip the hat he had on and his hat not brought along. The 100-year-old man sat down on one of the 2 empty benches, alone with his thoughts. The wretched birthday party at the home would start at 3 o'clock, and that was in 12 minutes. At any moment, they would be banging on the door to Alan's room, and then all hell would break loose. He smiled at the thought. Then, out of the corner of his eye, Alan saw that somebody was approaching. It was the slightly built young man heading straight for Alan with his big suitcase trailing behind him on 4 small wheels. Alan realized that he might not be able to avoid engaging the long-haired youth in conversation. Perhaps that wasn't so bad. He might gain insight into what today's young people thought about this and that. A conversation did take place, but without the depth of social analysis Alan had anticipated. The young man came to a halt a few yards away, seemed to study the man for a moment, and then said, "Hey!" Alan replied in a friendly tone, saying that he wished him a good afternoon, and then asked him if there was some way he could be of service. It turned out there was. The young man wanted Alan to keep an eye on the suitcase while the owner relieved himself, or as he expressed it, a need to take a dump. Alan replied that although he was old and decrepit, his eyesight was still in good repair, and it did not sound like too arduous a task to keep an eye on the young man's suitcase. He did recommend that the young man relieve himself with some urgency, without, of course, using the young man's terminology. So Alan had a bus to catch. The young man did not hear the last bit. His urgent need drove him toward the toilet before Alan had finished speaking. The 100-year-old man had never let himself be irritated by people, even when there's a good reason to be. And he was not annoyed by the uncouth manner of this youth. But he couldn't warn to him either, and that possibly played some part in what happened next. Bus number 202 rolled up outside the entrance to the terminal, just a few seconds after the young man had closed the toilet door behind him. Alan looked at the bus and then at the suitcase, then again at the bus and again at the suitcase. "It has wheels," he said to himself, "and there's a strap to pull it." And then Alan surprised himself by making what, you have to admit, was a decision that said yes to life. The bus driver was conscientious and polite. He stepped down and helped a very old man with a big suitcase to get on the bus. Alan thanked him and pulled out his wallet from the inside pocket of his jacket. The bus driver wondered if the gentleman was possibly going all the way to Strängnäs. But Alan thought it best to be frugal, and so he held out a 50-crown note and asked, "How far will this get me?" The driver said jovially that he was used to people who knew where they wanted to go, but not what it would cost. But this was quite the opposite. Then he looked at his bus schedule and replied that for 48 crowns you could travel on the bus. Alan thought that sounded fine. The driver put the newly stolen suitcase in the baggage area behind his seat, while Alan sat down in the front row on the right-hand side. From there, he could see through the window of the station's waiting room. The restroom door was still closed when the bus rolled off. Alan hoped for the young man's sake that he was having a pleasant time in there, bearing in mind the disappointment that was awaiting him. The bus was not exactly crowded that afternoon. In the middle of the back row, there was a middle-aged woman. In the middle, a young mother who had struggled on board with her 2 children, one of them on a baby carriage, and at the very front, an extremely old man. This passenger was wondering why he had stolen a big gray suitcase on 4 wheels. Was it because he could, and because the owner was a lout, or because the suitcase might contain a pair of shoes and even a hat? Or was it because the old man didn't have anything to lose? Alan really couldn't say why he did it. When life has gone into overtime, it's easy to take liberties, he thought, and he made himself comfortable in the seat. So far, Alan was satisfied with the way the day had developed. Then he closed his eyes for the afternoon nap. At that same moment, Director Alice knocked on the door to room 1 at the old folks' home. She knocked again, and she knocked again. "Stop fooling around, Alan. The mayor and everyone else has arrived. Do you hear me? You haven't been at the bottle again, have you? Come out this minute. Alan, Alan." At about the same time, the door opened to what was, for the time being, the only functioning toilet in the station. Out stepped a young man who was doubly relieved. He took a few steps toward the middle of the waiting room, tightening his belt with one hand and combing his hair with the fingers of the other hand. Then he stopped, stared at the 2 empty benches, and looked left and right, upon which he exclaimed, "What the damned hell?" Then words failed him before he found his voice again. "You're a dead man, you old bastard, once I found you." Just after 3 o'clock in the afternoon on May 2nd, the calm of Macabing was shattered for what would be several days. At first, Director Alice at the old folks' home was worried rather than angry and pulled out her master key. Since Alan had not concealed his escape route, it was immediately obvious that the birthday boy had climbed out of the window. Judging by the tracks, he had then stood among the pansies in the flower bed before disappearing. By virtue of his position, the mayor felt he could take command. He ordered the staff to search in pairs. Alan couldn't be far away. The searchers should concentrate on the immediate vicinity. 1 pair was dispatched to the park, 1 to the state-run liquor store, a place that Alan had occasionally frightened. Director Alice knew 1 to the other shop was on Main Street and 1 to the computer center up on the hill. The mayor himself would stay at the old folks' home to keep an eye on the residents who hadn't vanished into thin air and to ponder the next move. He told the marchers that they should be discreet. There was no need to generate unnecessary publicity about this fair. In the general confusion, the mayor forgot that 1 of the pairs of searchers he had just sent out consisted of a reporter from the local paper and her photographer. The bus station was not included in the mayor's primary search area. In that location, however, a very angry, slightly built young man with long, greasy blonde hair, a scraggly beard, and a jean jacket with the words "Never Again" on the back had already searched every corner of the building. Since there was no trace of either a very old man or a suitcase, the young man took some decisive steps toward the little man behind the only open ticket window for the purpose of obtaining information as to the old man's possible travel plans. Although the little man was generally bored with his work, he still had his professional pride. So he explained to the loud-mouthed young man that the passenger's privacy was not something that could be compromised, adding firmly that under no circumstances whatever would he give him any information of the type that he wished to learn. The young man stood in silence for a moment. He then moved 5 yards to the left to the not very solid door to the ticket office. He didn't bother to check whether it was locked. Instead, he took a step back and kicked the door in with the front of his right boot on so that splinters flew in every direction. The little man did not even have time to lift the telephone receiver to phone for help before he was dangling in the air in front of this young man, who grasped him firmly by the ears. "I might not know anything about privacy, but I'm good in getting people to talk," said the young man to the little ticket seller before he let him drop down with a bump into the revolving chair. At which point the young man explained what he intended to do with the little man's genitals, with the help of a hammer and nails, if the little man did not comply with his wishes. The description was so realistic that the little man immediately decided to say what he thought, namely that the old man in question had presumably taken a bus in the direction of Strängnäs. Whether the man had taken a suitcase with him he couldn't say, as he was not the sort of person who spied on his customers. The ticket seller then stopped talking to ascertain how satisfied the young man was with what he had said, and immediately determined that it would be best for him to provide further information. So he said that on the journey there were 12 stops and that the old man could, of course, get into any one of those. The person who would know was the bus driver, and according to the timetable, he would be back at 10 after 7 that same evening when the bus made its return journey. The young man sat down beside the terrified little man with throbbing ears. "Just need to think," he said. So he thought. He thought that he should certainly be able to shake the bus driver's mobile phone number out of the little man, and then call the driver and say that the old man's suitcase was actually stolen property. But then, of course, there was a risk that the bus driver would involve the police, and that was not something the young man wanted. Besides, it was probably not so urgent, really, because the old man seemed dreadfully old, and now they had a suitcase to drag around. He would need to travel by train, bus, or taxi if he wanted to continue his journey from this station. He would thus leave new tracks behind him, and there would always be somebody who could be dangled by the ears to say where the old man was heading. The young man had confidence in his ability to persuade people to tell him what they knew. When the youth had finished thinking, he decided to wait for the bus in question to return so he could interview the driver without undue politeness. When he had decided, the young man got up again and explained to the ticket seller what would happen to him, his wife, his children, and his home if he told the police or anybody else what had just occurred. The little man had neither wife nor children, but he was eager to keep his ears and genitals more or less intact. So he gave his word as an employee of the National Railways, and he wouldn't say a peep. That was a promise he kept until the next day. The two-man search groups came back to the old man's home and reported on what they had seen, or rather, hadn't seen. The mayor instinctively did not want to involve the police, and he was desperately trying to think of alternatives when the local newspaper reporter dared to ask, "And what are you going to do now, Mr. Mayor?" The mayor was silent for a few moments, and then he said, "Call the police, of course." God, how he hated the free press. Alan woke when the driver kindly nudged him and announced that they had now reached the station. Shortly afterward, the driver maneuvered the suitcase out the front door of the bus with Alan close behind. The driver asked if he could now manage on his own, and Alan said that the driver had no need to worry in that respect. Then Alan thanked him for his help and waved goodbye as the bus rolled out onto the highway again. Tall fir trees blocked the afternoon sun, and Alan was starting to feel a bit chilly in his thin jacket and indoor slippers. He could see no sign of Byringe, let alone its station. There was just forest, forest, forest in all directions, and a little gravel road leading to the right. Alan thought that perhaps there were warm clothes in the suitcase he had on impulse brought along with him. Unfortunately, the suitcase was locked, and without a screwdriver or some other tool, it was surely hopeless to try to open it. There was no other option but to start moving. Otherwise, he would freeze to death. And given past experiences, he was pretty sure he wouldn't succeed in doing that, even if he tried. The suitcase had a strap at the top, and if you pulled it, the suitcase rolled along nicely on the small wheels. Alan followed the gravel road into the forest with short, shuffling steps. The suitcase followed just behind him, skidding on the gravel. After a few hundred yards, Alan came to what must be the station, a closed-down building next to a most definitely and absolutely former railway line. Alan was in excellent shape as far as the centenarians went, but it was all getting to be a bit too much. He sat down on the suitcase to gather his thoughts and strength. To Alan's left stood the shabby yellow two-story station. All the windows on the bottom floor were covered with planks. To his right, you could follow the no longer used railway line into the distance, straight as an arrow, even deeper into the forest. Nature had not yet succeeded in entirely eating up the tracks, but it was only a matter of time. The wooden platform was evidently no longer safe to walk on. On the outermost planking, you could still read a painted sign: "Do not walk on the track." The track was certainly not dangerous to walk on, thought Alan, but who in his right mind would voluntarily walk on the platform? That question was answered immediately, because at that very moment, the shabby door of the station building was opened, and a man in his 70s wearing a cap stepped out of the house. Given his big boots, he clearly trusted the planks not to give way, and he was entirely focused on the old man in front of him. His initial attitude was hostile, but then he seemed to change his mind, possibly as a result of seeing what a decrepit specimen of humanity had invaded his territory. Alan sat on the newly stolen suitcase, not knowing what to say, and in any case lacking the energy to say it. But he looked steadily at the man, letting him make the first move. "Who are you, and what are you doing in my station?" asked the man with the cap. Alan didn't answer. He couldn't decide whether he was dealing with friend or foe. But then he decided it would be wise not to argue with the only person around, someone who might even let Alan inside before the evening chill set in. He decided to tell it like it was. Alan told the man that his name was Alan, that he was exactly 100 years old and spry for his age. So spry, in fact, that he was on the run from the old age home. He had also had time to steal a suitcase from a young man who by now would certainly not be particularly happy about it. His knees were not for the moment at their best, and he would not very much like to give them a break. Alan then fell silent, awaiting the court's verdict. "Is that so?" said the young man in the cap. Then he smiled. "A thief?" He jumped nimbly down from the platform and went over to the centenarian to have a closer look. "Are you really 100 years old? In that case, you must be hungry." Alan could not follow the logic, but of course he was hungry. So he asked what was on the menu, and a nip of the hard stuff might be included. The man with the cap stretched out his hand, introduced himself as Julius Johnston, and pulled the old man to his feet. He then announced that he would possibly carry Alan's suitcase, and that roast elk was on the bill if it suited, and that there would absolutely be a nip of the hard stuff to go with it, or rather enough to take care of the knees and the rest of him too. And that's it.